Greetings all from a hotel room in Fort Leavenworth. Of course, I realized after I got here that some of the materials I wanted for some of the videos I had planned are still in Texas. So, plan B. I needed to come up with a topic which I could actually dig into a little bit up here. And so, today's word of the day is ferroequinologist. And no, I have no idea how to say that in German. Now, this is a little bit off topic for my standard fare, but I think it's a topic of World War II which doesn't get much coverage. It's valid, and I've been playing a bit more Transport Fever 2 recently. So, what the hey? Generally speaking, most mainline locomotive production from Germany fell into one of four classes during the war. This is the pre-war Class 44, a 210. The three wartime classes were the Class 50, a 210, Class 52, a 210, and Class 42, a 210. The Germans really liked their decapods, not least because with so many axles, they tended to have a relatively light axle loading and could be used on even lighter branch lines. There were a few electrics, tank locomotives, and other industrial locos built in the war, but the vast majority were of these four. Now, you can look up the specifications of these classes yourselves, but they were hugely successful and still in mainline service in the late 1970s. Well, as they did with almost everything else, the US Army did an assessment of the state of locomotive production in Germany during the war. It may surprise you to hear that trains, and locomotive facilities in general, were never directly targeted during World War II. I mean, sure, you will have seen the videos of attack aircraft strafing and rocketing trains, and absolutely the lines themselves, particularly marshalling yards, were hit. But when every notable town has a locomotive servicing facility, each of which being somewhat smaller than the size of a marshalling yard, it was considered that destroying locomotive support and repair facilities just wasn't worth the amount of effort it would require to do the job. Besides, Allied intel was concluding that German motive power and rolling stock was taking a significant beating. Again, witness all that gun camera footage. Something must have been getting hit on the yard bombings, and they had observed the amount of emphasis that the Germans had been placing on their locomotive production. But the intel was wrong. Outside of a period in 1941-1942, there was never a shortage of locomotives in Germany, and in fact they were building far more than they needed. The first thing to do is to look at the sheer size of the German locomotive industry before the war. In the 1930s, Germany had about 21,000 steam and 500 electric locomotives, and it built about 1,500 more locomotives in 1938. But of interest, of those 1,500 or so locomotives, over 2/3 were for export. If export sales ever dropped for whatever reason that could possibly happen in 1939 or 1940, there would inherently be a fair bit of unused capacity available for production for domestic use. If that wasn't enough, German officials decided to start a 4-year plan in 1939. Over the next 4 years, production of locomotives for home use will gradually increase from about 500 locos in 1939 to 2,600 in 1942. And it turned out that actually was not enough. Something that the Deutsche Reichsbahn officials hadn't counted on when they came up with this 4-year plan was the Russian front. And trains would be the lion's share of transport provider over the long distances involved. Some 500 locomotives had been transferred from the Reichsbahn to the Ostbahn for use mainly in Poland by July 1941, but by February 1942, with the transportation requirements necessary to cover from Germany to as far afield as Leningrad and Rostov, 5,360 or so locomotives had been transferred to the Ostbahn, leading to a 20% drop in locomotive availability in Germany. Worse still, the lousy conditions on the Eastern Front, both in terms of weather and the logistical environment, meant that almost 1 in 3 locomotives in the entire system were in or awaiting heavy repair by 1942. Remember, attrition by combat is not a significant portion of this yet. This is purely a reflection of the operational situation. The officials did 3 things in response to this. First, they changed the regulations to allow heavier loadings of freight cars and reduced demurrage time. Basically how long the cars sit around waiting. Secondly, They took locomotives from France, Belgium, and the Netherlands for use in Western Germany. Officially, they were leased, although I can't tell you just how much the owners were paid. The number of leased locomotives peaked in 1942 at 6,400. Finally, they also simply turned on the production taps. The new production plan of March 1942 foresaw an increase in production from 150 a month in June to 500 a month by the following year, and they attained this. The single highest production month for Germany was 535 locomotives in August of 1943, before dropping back to the 300s until October 44. However, again, to a large extent, the devil is in the details. The figure of but 339 locomotives produced in August 1944 may be well below the 500s obtained in mid-1943, but in terms of efficiency, if you divide the tonnage of locomotives built per month, you'll see that each worker was about 27% more efficient that month than in 1943, and just over twice as efficient as they were in 1941. Now, part of this was also the simplification of the wartime design. A Class 44 took about 60,000 man-hours to put together in the plant itself. Class 50 required about half that many, and the Class 52 was going to drop that to about 40%. Not only that, but some of the locomotives were better suited for the conditions, even though they were simplified. In February 1943, the first of the Class 52 condenser locomotives was shipped by Henschel. They ended up building about 167 of them. These locomotives basically recycled the steam back into the tender to be condensed back into distilled water, which provided a couple of major benefits. The first was simply range. For 1,900 or so liters of water, 1,000 gallons, the locomotive was good for 1,000 kilometers. Finding good water supply on the Eastern Front wasn't easy at the best of times, and it wasn't made better by partisans knocking down water towers or the like. And after asking around, that's a pretty insane amount of distance that you can go on 1,000 gallons. The second advantage was tactical. With an entirely different exhaust system, the draft isn't the same. There's less of a discharge into the air, the telltale smoke trail, as it were, which might attract the eye of a Sturmovik or P-39 pilot. It simply didn't exist. And thus, these locomotives proved more survivable. The workforce making all these things was primarily foreign. In 1941, the 22,500 or so construction workers were all German, but less than half of the workers in 1943 were German. Granted, that didn't necessarily mean that they were all in Germany. Locomotive plants in France and the Low Countries contributed 10,000 workers to this force. Though the locomotive facilities were never specifically targeted, some were still hit. The worst off was Krupp. Krupp's facility in Essen did far more than just make locomotives, and the facility was very much a target. However, the loco facilities were on the edges of the plant area, so they only ever got hit by minor damage, like broken windows in January 1943, for example. It wasn't a major locomotive production facility either, putting out 20, maybe 25 locomotives per month. However, a raid on the 12th of March with incendiaries did land on the locomotive plant and basically shut down operations entirely. Production gradually restarted, getting back up to 2 or 3 a month, and then on 23rd of October, HE landed on the boiler house, and that put an end to the Krupp Essen locomotive manufacturing department. Again though, a loss of one factory barely made a 4% dent in production. The largest locomotive plant in Europe belonged to Henschel und Sohn in the Kassel area. It had 3 major facilities. One was converted to tank and truck production, and the other 2 stayed as locomotive production and assembly facilities. Though Kassel in general and the Henschel tank manufacturing plant in particular were targets of air raids as early as August 1942, it wasn't until October 43 when any serious damage happened to the locomotive plant. Production went from 80 a month down to 30 before climbing up to the 50s. Henschel started to receive the specific attentions of the U.S. Army Air Forces in September and October 1944, and the locomotive plants were not spared. From 64 locos produced in August, September and October saw 2 each. Things gradually increased again with another set of raids in early 45, causing minor setbacks. However, by this point, Germany had finally decided it had more important uses for the steel than building locomotives. You know, tanks and guns and things to stop the evil red commie horde coming one way and the allies that are already crossing into the German border. Individual locomotive utilization rates in Germany never increased during the war. And in fact, it never actually reached the 145 kilometers a day average that they had been running in 1938. They were averaging at about 134 to 142. There are several reasons for this. Firstly, with the massive increase in locomotive manufacturing, even if the traffic requirements went up, there were plenty of locomotives to do the job. To put it in perspective, from 1941 to 1944 inclusive, German factories made almost 13,000 locomotives for domestic use. The US built approximately 4,000 locomotives for domestic use at the same time. Now, of course, Alco and Baldwin were heavily involved in making many more tanks than the Germans. But then Henschel was a big tank manufacturer too. Secondly, as the war developed, not necessarily to the advantage of Germany, there was no need to have the motive power to haul trains to the far end of the Ukraine anymore. It wouldn't have been possible anyway. The Soviets would have regauged the tracks at the front line. Finally, as the air campaign really started to take into account the German rail infrastructure hitting those yards and bridges, there was often no line for the trains to run on. They had lots of idle capacity. So when a fighter pilot did get the satisfaction of blowing up a train, all the German railway folks had to do was just clear the line with a recovery crane and grab the next locomotive out of the roundhouse. And hopefully your engineer and fireman had survived. It also meant that the German railways had built a shed load of modern, efficient, easily maintained locomotives, which allowed much of the older fleet to be retired after the war. The wartime classes continued on mainline service into the late 1970s in West Germany, even longer on the other side of the Iron Curtain. So there you go, some wartime information I will bet most of you never knew. Hope you found it all interesting and informative. I'll talk to you on the next one.